Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti all'Istituto Italiano di Cultura. Tonight we will speak about Antonio Tabucchi. Antonio Tabucchi, I think, is one of the best Italian writers of the second part of the 20th century. I also met him many years ago, and he's also a very kind and intelligent person, and was really a pleasure to have known him. He's well known for a novel, Sostiene Pereira, Pereira maintains, I think, in English. But I think that the best of his work are the collection of short stories. In particular, I like very much Little Misunderstandings of No Importance, but in any case, I think that he is a very, very good writer of short stories. And the book we are going to present tonight, published by Archipelago Press, Message from the Shadows, is something like a best of his short stories, with translation of different translators, and I think some first translation in this book. I would like to thank Archipelago Book for their collaboration for this presentation, and also Patrick Smalley for his help in publishing this book. For speak tonight of this collection, we have Elisabeth Harris, who is one of the translators of these short stories, and is a translator in general of contemporary Italian fiction. She translated books like Mairo Rigoni's Stern novel Giacomo Season, Giulio Mozzi's story collection This is the Garden, and Antonio Tabucchi novels Tristano Dies and For Isabel and Mandala, both with Archipelago Books. For her various translations of Tabucchi, she has won a Penheim Translation Fund Grant, a NIA Translation Fellowship, the Italian Prose in Translation Award, and the National Translation Award. She is currently working on Tabucchi's collection Stories with Pictures, forthcoming with Archipelago. And we have also Rivka Galchen. Is an award-winning fiction writer and journalist. Her work appears often in The New Yorker, Harper's, the London Reviews of Book, and the New York Times. She is the author of 3 books: Atmospheric Disturbances, a novel for Farrar-Straus and Giroux in 2008, American Innovations, a collection of short story for FGS2 in 2014, and Little Labours, essays with new directions in 2016. So please welcome Elisabeth Harris and Rivka Galchen.
So we're going to start with a reading. Yeah.
We'll start with a reading from. Can you all hear? Can you hear all right? Volume okay? Yeah? Okay.
Actually, why don't you bring the microphone a little closer to you?
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Staring at me.
Okay. I'm going to read. I actually translated one story in this collection. I've translated 2 of his novels for Archipelago. And I was thrilled to get the chance to translate a story for the collection as well. This one has, I believe, never been translated into English before. Is that right? Yeah. And it comes from L'Angelo Nero. Is that the title?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. And it's the Italian actually comes from, the title in English is Night, Sea, or Distance, and the title comes from a poem, and you just pronounced the author's name. It's Drummond di Andrade. Is that right?
Andrade.
Okay, Andrade. The title of the story comes from his poem, from a Brazilian poet, and this is something that's very typical of Antonio Tabucchi, is his references to other authors. It starts this way. I'm going to read a paragraph of the English, the first full paragraph, and then I've asked to have that full paragraph of the story read in Italian, so you can get a sense of the sound, I hope. So this is how it starts. There, from where things originate, they return, each paying the punishment of having come according to the unjust ordering of time. And that's a quote from Anaximander. Every time he imagined how that night might have gone, he'd hear Thaddeus's voice, nasal and ironic, making one of those comments of his that meant everything and nothing, because it's a good viaticum. And immediately everything would start to take shape. Outlines would emerge. The Jardim do Príncipe Real, with its ancient tree and ring of yellow houses, the narrow street a tram rattled over, that cold evening of a far-off year, November 1969, that third-floor room, tiny, crammed with books, and his friends in that room, the four of them, their faces back then, already grown men and women, sure, but they always looked younger in those days. Who knows why? Maybe it was how they dressed or wore their hair. Anyway, they were kids, barely 20, the four of them full of hope and goodwill, there to speak with the famous poet, practically an old man now, who in his youth was bellicose, ferocious, but then his will bent to events, to life, his ferocity turned to sarcasm and disappointment, and when it came to battles, he developed the skepticism of one who'd fought and lost, and now believed the fight was in vain.
Ogni volta, quando immaginava come avrebbero potuto essersi svolti i fatti quella notte, gli arrivava la voce nasale e ironica di Tadeusz, che scandiva una di quelle sue frasi che volevano dire tutto e niente, perché è un buon viatico. E subito tutto cominciava a prendere corpo e a delinearsi nei contorni. Il Jardim do Príncipe Real, con l'albero centenario e la sua chiostra di case gialle, la strada stretta percorsa da un tram sferagliante, quella sera fredda di un anno lontano, il novembre del 1969, la stanza al secondo piano, ingombra di libri, minuscola, e dentro i suoi amici, loro quattro con i volti di allora, già donne e uomini fatti, sì, ma a quell'epoca si dimostravano sempre meno anni, chissà perché, forse la maniera di vestire o il taglio di capelli, e comunque erano dei ragazzi, poco più che ventenni, loro quattro, pieni di speranza e di buona volontà, a parlare col celebre poeta, ora già quasi un vecchio, che in gioventù era stato battagliero e feroce, e poi si era piegato suo malgrado agli eventi, alla vita. La ferocia gli si era cambiata in sarcasmo e amarezza, e delle battaglie gli avanzava lo scetticismo di chi ha combattuto le battaglie, le ha perdute e ritiene che sia vano combattere battaglie.
And at times when he imagined that night, he even tried to avoid Thaddeus's insidious comment, as if a strange reluctance, almost nausea, pushed him toward the final outcome, toward the breakdown and pain the victims would have to go through. And then he saw them already out on the street, that poor group of kids saying goodnight to each other, then one of them telling a joke or saying one last thing, still 3 or 4 minutes like this, just by chance, no real reason for it that night. And just then, the car would come, inescapable, for that rendezvous awaiting them, for that experience they truly had to go through because they were the ones who'd gone through it. But also just then, and just as inescapable, came Thaddeus's comment, almost meaningless, yet devious if you really thought about it. And then his imagination, the imagination of the one who, after so much time was imagining that night, would push the four friends backwards, like a film projected in reverse. And he saw them climb the stairs backwards, return to Tadeus's landing, re-enter the apartment. That's it. They were in the doorway, ready to leave again, everything taking shape again. And they had to relive the preamble, the introit to what they went through that night. They were in the doorway saying goodnight to the old poet after an evening spent talking about poetry. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. It's a group of four young people talking with this poet they admire. It seems like it's an old poet that Tadeus is recalling, but it's actually Tadeus himself who is imagining it. They're joking around. They quote the poem, the title of the story. They quote that, and they're laughing. And I'm going to start in after Tadeus makes a joke. And the others laughed because they knew what he meant, and because laughter was called for that night. Now and then a car went by. The street lights were off, a police ploy for keeping the subversives from gathering outside. The only light on the entire street came from the entranceway of the Adega Val do Rio. Then further on, the Guitarra Dorada, with a neon guitar, one string burned out, and below also a neon, Crustáceos e Moriscos. Tiago went to the window and said it felt like curfew. And then he placed his hand on his chest like he was taking a strange oath or something was weighing on him. And he said, they won't get to win this time. They won't be able to rig these elections too. But then he turned toward the glass and whispered, why would they let us win? They've been in control for 40 years. And then someone laughed. Who can say? Maybe no one. Maybe just a sigh that sounded like nervous laughter. And at that moment, there came a siren's distant wail, ambulance or police, and Joanna, perhaps wanting to cover up that grim sound, said, maybe we could read some more. And she looked around, her eyes anxious, the eyes of a young woman who wanted to believe in life and poetry, and her hands nervous, perhaps because she sensed that the others understood her entreaty but just couldn't do it, couldn't find any hope or illusion in reading lines of poetry. It had reached that point, the evening, still early, though it felt more like the middle of the night, and the early evening was still present, still filled that space and had formed a stagnant pool, a curse, like a spell to be broken, that made the people within those walls feel like captives. Who knows if one of them moved to break the spell, and if it was Tiago or Michel, who can say? And maybe it was because he mysteriously sensed the spell holding them captive that he uttered those words as an incantation, raised his glass with a voice that should have been full of good cheer, but instead was grim. To November 1969, the month of the fall of Salazarism. Strange how November seemed present, conjured by those words. It had been a clear October day, and they spent it on the beach with a picnic of fruit and sandwiches. Someone got up the nerve to dive into the ocean. The sun was hot, and on the way home they felt their faces burning. And now suddenly you could feel November, could hear the trees rustling in the botanical garden. A nasty wind had risen, whistling in the cracks, and leaves flew past the windows. They should toast again. They sensed it, to the newly printed book that lay on the table, a small book of poems that Tadeus had picked up that night from the printers so he could read to them before it was published. But he seemed to be avoiding that toast, as though he felt embarrassed or reluctant or slightly ashamed for writing those poems and getting them published that November full of others' illusions when he had no illusions left, a month already marked by defeat, which no one should pin their hopes on. Until someone, maybe Louisa or Joanna, or maybe both, by strange coincidence owing to a shyness that often results in trite phrases, raised their glasses and said in unison, to poetry. And Tadeus muttered, his voice nasal and ironic, because it's a good viaticum. And just then, The one imagining how that night might have gone suddenly realized that Tadeus's words were creating a vicious cycle, because it was then that the friends, detecting a hint of goodbye in those words, slipped on their coats, went to the door, opened it, stood there a moment saying goodnight, and just then, as if it were a goodbye, an incantation, an erratic omen, Tadeus repeated, "Because it's a good viaticum." And then someone responded, "Tonight, sea or far away." Maybe Tiago, and it was also because of this, who knows why, but someone was shutting the door again, and Tadeus was saying, "There's still another glass. What a pity not to finish Michel's bottle." And everything began again in the imagination of the one imagining that night, like a pantomime or witch's spell, from the door to the armchairs, from the armchairs to the door, like poor creatures bewitched and condemned to senseless repetition, forced to mime and run through yet again the prelude to the horrible experience awaiting them in the night, that an imagination didn't have the courage to make them endure the way they had to endure. Until enough. Now they've left, are finally headed down the stairs. The light bulb on the second floor landing is burned out. Someone trips, someone laughs. Tiago, stop pushing. That's Louisa or Joanna. Oh, stop being such little old ladies. That's Tiago. And finally they're on the main floor, the button push that operates the lock, a click, and now they're outside. Ah, finally free from the vicious circle of a comet holding them captive in the imagination of the one imagining how that night might have gone. Finally outside in the night, standing in front of the dimly lit Principe Real garden, almost no one passing. No one was out there, like a real curfew, a phantom city all around, barred windows, and them on the sidewalk saying good night, a harmless joke or two, trying to rid themselves of the evening's gloom, still clinging to them like a damp veil. The car approached, headlights off, silently, and by the time they noticed, it had already pulled deftly to the curb, window partway down, dark inside, impossible to see the driver, just a gun barrel pointed in their direction, just barely shifting in small ticks, taking aim at each of them in turn, as if trying to decide which one to shoot. And that's the first part of the story.
Thank you so much for that. You know, as I was listening to it again, I was thinking about how in some ways it evokes a lot of kind of classic Tabucchi characteristics. The story feels quite nested. Time is a little shadowy and keeps rearranging itself. There's a sudden intrusion of consequences and violence. There's a poet.
Yes.
I was curious about how you chose the story, since you've worked with Tabucchi's work before, and
I did not choose the
you
story.
didn't choose the
No,
story.
Jill Schoolman, who is the publisher, chose the story and asked me to translate it, and I said yes, please.
And
Yeah.
maybe I'm just curious myself. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to translate Tabucchi, because you've done 2 full novels.
Right. So far, I've translated 2 novels. One is very slight for Isabel Mandela, and they're actually out there. One is teeny tiny. I should have brought them in. And again, I did not choose Antonio Tabucchi. Jill, I chose Archipelago. I years ago had submitted a novel to Jill, who was working then at 7 Stories Press, and they didn't accept. It was a translation of a novel. They did not accept it, but Jill was so kind. And years later, when she had started Archipelago, and I think it was actually established at that point, I wrote her and I asked her if she might consider, working with me on a project. And she said, "What about translating a little bit of this?" And she sent me a few pages of Tristano More, which is Tristano Dies, and so I immediately started to translate and was very confused, because it starts out with a seeming poem, and it was a bad poem, and I started to translate it, and then I thought, what is this? And And I asked an Italian friend, and it wasn't a poem at all, it was a song. And so the first thing that I had to translate was Rosamunda. Yeah, I had to translate the beer barrel polka version that's actually in Italian, but it had to have the English, it had to have the actual English words because beer barrel polka didn't work because Rosamunda's a character in the novel. So that's how I started off, was with this crazy.
Quite a challenge.
Yeah, yeah. And then Jill asked me to translate after I had worked on that with her. She asked me to translate for Isabella Mandala, and then the one that will be coming out, I think maybe next year, is Stories with Pictures, which is also it's a mix of stories and nonfiction and poems, and each of those works is tied to a work of art. They're all influenced by artwork, so it's Stories with Pictures.
I was also, for English language readers like myself, many of us come to Tabucchi first through Pereira Declares, or sometimes translated Pereira Maintains,
Right.
and which is maybe my favorite political novel ever because it's the quietest political novel.
Right.
And I was curious because even reading it as an English language reader, I thought this is a tricky thing to translate because it's so it'll often stick on a phrase or word that sticks in the character's mind, like viaticum in this story. In that one, Pereira Declares itself is a phrase that is used so much. And so I was curious what kind of interesting problems you encounter
Because
with
of
Tabucchi.
that. Yeah. Well, I would imagine that one must have been particularly tricky. I mean, they actually changed the title. So the refrain throughout the novel was Pereira Declares, and then they changed it to Maintains, so that it became a different refrain through the novel. I have no idea why they changed that. For me, because I love translating voice. That's my favorite part of translating is the music of it. For me, it's the joy of it. So that is that repetition that actually is Tabucchi. That's not typical Italian. That use of repetition is very, very much something that Tabucchi does. That's part of his style, and I'd go with it. I just love that, and I actually think English sustains repetition very well. I think that a lot of translators will tell you that in translating a work, that rather than just bring it into English, that when you see something that's there in the original, that actually to draw it forth, sometimes you exaggerate it, that you actually emphasize it even more to render it so that it has a similar effect. And I think that might be a bit true of my use of repetition with Tabucchi. So.
I also notice in a lot of these stories and in a lot of Tabucchi, there's a lot of conversations with strangers, chance encounters, people, nested storytelling, and I wonder how that voice issue is as a translator, or what is interesting about handling those nested voices, and I feel like it's very characteristic of the feel of his prose.
Right. Well, and it is decidedly challenging, because you have to figure out. I mean, you have to create those characters basically when you're translating it into English. You look at those voices and decide who those people are. And in some ways it's recognizing just, the slightest nuances of what's there in the Italian and bring it into English. But not only that, it's that translating in particular dialogue is somewhat like translating poetry, I think, in that the sound really has to be manipulated. In dialogue, just like the sound of that opening of that novel that was a song. It was very much about rhyme, and so I had to really manipulate the Italian to get at the hard rhyme in English, because we don't rhyme very well in English. We're kind of rhyme poor. With dialogue, when you render it in English, you have to manipulate it from the Italian so that it has a natural sound. And so sometimes you have to move actually fairly far afield of what's actually there. So you're dealing with that, and then of course is the nuance of character with that story, with the stories. I've done that with. I noticed Clouds is one that has that here. He's talking with Isabella, I think is the name of the character's talking with Isabella. I've also translated some of his stories that have that conversation between. It's charming, and this one is I think she's a teenager. Sometimes he has stories where it's a stranger who's talking with a child, and you can tell that it's a somewhat bitter main character who's in some ways being rejuvenated by speaking with this stranger child.
There's also in this book very, very short story told from the point of view of a whale, looking at a human. So I sort of feel like that voice moves a lot. I was another
That's
prominent.
the great thing about it. It's his imagination.
Yeah, his imagination shifts. Yeah. No, another strong characteristic of Tabucchi for me is his obsession with Pessoa.
Yeah.
And Pessoa coming up as a character so often, and in Portugal is a place. And I was curious to hear you talk a little bit about how that plays into his work.
Yeah. Well, it permeates it, an interest. Borges, Pessoa, this element of sort of breaking things into fragments. And then what you were talking about, this sort of nesting of characters, I see this sort of the various voices of Pessoa as something that infiltrates, his work. Yes, and as a character himself coming into stories. Again, I've also translated some stories where Pessoa is on he's on a ship, and it's in his point of view. His work is constantly referring to other authors, and if you didn't know, Pessoa's, he and his wife translated, I believe, almost all of Pessoa into Italian. Yeah, and so heavily influenced, but certainly his own man. But he seems to really speak to him and to Brazilian and Portuguese literature, in general.
And I think it seems like that sort of habit of taking on a voice, sort of reversing things so that the imaginary world feels sort of more concrete, and the concrete world sort of fades into the background.
Right. And I think that a part of that also is the way that you can't tell because I was reading this, but oftentimes the way that he structures his prose is these very, very dense paragraphs that don't really break into scene, not entirely. They're a lot of summary, and it feels like it's in the distant past. And when someone speaks, oftentimes there isn't a new line of dialogue, a paragraph, and oftentimes there aren't quotes either. It just is a part of this sort of mishmash of prose, and it feels like it's there and yet it's not there at the same time.
He's like a really gentle Thomas Bernhard.
Yeah,
He's not angry
Yeah,
in the same way.
Yeah, except for this story, actually, I purposely read only the first part because it's actually an incredibly grisly and dark story. I mean, I'm sure you got that sense anyway with where it leads, but it becomes. I mean, it was actually very hard to translate it. I had to debate things that I didn't want to debate about, how to translate rape, and it was not pretty and disturbing. So this is, I believe, might be the darkest story actually in the collection. Am I right on that? Yeah, it's beautiful, but it's very dark.
And on that same story, there's an interesting way in which the story feels like it's going to be a slow, chatty story of some people sitting around having spoken about poetry and had some drinks, and that mood is maintained for quite a while. And I'm curious what you think about that abrupt switch.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and what happens without, giving the entire story away is that, I mean, you already know because it keeps on returning to that because time is so discombobulated as it often is in Tabucchi, that the car that shows up has a secret police agent in it. It's not, and he points the gun at them, and that's where I ended. And from then on, it's startlingly realistic, but it's not realistic at the same time. It's still the one who imagined it, who gets swept into a garden. And I think it's actually that the poet, Tadeus, wished that he had done more and that he was probably hiding upstairs while his friends, the poor people, were whisked away and scared to death by this secret agent. And it's intense and graphic, and yet at the same time, it's also surreal from the get-go. I mean, this police agent, the first thing he says to them is not put your hands up, but put up your tiny hands. That is just strange. The way that he speaks is odd. And almost immediately after that, because the one who imagines it in the future, the one who imagines it also imagines a fish coming out the window and falling into the gutter and flopping around. And so,
A fish that can be saved as
yes,
well.
Yes,
That's an interesting aspect.
one of the women gets down and cradles it like a baby. And that, so the story has this intense, dark experience that occurs and yet ends nowhere, in relation to where it's crazy where it ends. I don't know if I should maybe just leave it at that and let you all, read the ending, but it's a very bizarre, surreal ending to this story that includes the fish.
A sea bass,
Yeah,
I believe.
sea bass.
Yeah.
Which was actually a bit of a debate for me about what to translate that as, because it could also be translated as a grouper. It's a chernia. Is my pronouncement chernia? Chernia. See how terrible I was not going to read that Italian paragraph. And that could be I think more commonly as a grouper, but I just couldn't have the grouper as it had to be imagistically. It just had to be sea bass to be more visual, and so it's close in family. So I chose sea bass for that to make it more visually, have more impact.
Especially because grouper feels like Groupon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I just didn't think it would have the same kind of impact for the reader. So.
And there's also stories in here. Often in artwork is directly invoked and sort of almost gives the shape to the story. For example, in one story, the
Flying creatures.
I wasn't actually thinking of that
okay.
one, but that's also a great one. When the character is looking at Las Meninas and hears
Yes.
about a friend of his dying.
The reversal game, right?
The reversal, and it's just quite. It's almost as if it allows the story to have an unusual shape because you kind of feel stabilized because he's looking at Las Meninas and he basically tells you to look at the figure in the background, and he's
Right.
trying to solve this issue of the figure in the background and make the figure in the background become the figure in the foreground. And it's sort of, the story is quite meandering and strange, except for not at all, because it's tightly held.
Right.
You're waiting for this reversal.
Yeah. That's right. And he does this, constant. It's either he's referencing artists or Pessoa, or it's just constant. I feel sometimes in translating him that I'm always waiting for what he's going to do next, what trick he's going to. I maybe this isn't the right thing to say, but I don't trust him. As I'm translating, when something starts to get a little weird, I almost always immediately Google it. Like I just type the line, and almost always it shows up as a translation of a poem by someone who's in Portuguese literature. I mean, it's amazing how often he encompasses this in his work, which very wisely I think Jill does not
forefront.
Yeah, we don't have little footnotes, stuck in saying this is from. I mean, I have all of that in my, my draft. I get overly excited and I have little notes. I reference all the, it's all in the drafts. But none of it is, unless when you're reading it, you feel that there's a difference. You feel the difference of these voices, as you were saying. But that's all you get.
And I wonder if also that helps contribute. The stories are 201, and the novels feel like they have to be written, like they're full of emotion. I can't explain it, but they have a sense of conviction, even though they're charming. They try to be charming, like someone who's sort of stuck in a train car with you and doesn't want to be too imposing for the journey. And I just, I'm curious how you think about that juxtaposition, because so often the kind of cliche is that something that's sort of highly brainy or intellectually referenced is somehow not emotional, but this seems like an example of the opposite.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so because it isn't about the brainy.
Sure.
Yeah. It's, I mean, that's a part of the voice, but it's very much about the humanity. Also behind those authors, you know. So I think because he creates characters so beautifully, and they're not always entirely real, but they're all. You love them, and this today's character who actually shows up everywhere. Not only does he reference other authors, he references himself constantly. Isabel shows up all over the place. For Isabel Mandela, she's in Requiem. She's a character of Requiem. Tadeus is everywhere as well. He's also in Tristano Dies as a different kind of character. And then, of course, he's here. And he's, he's an old man who's failed his friends. That's how, and he's very human, even while the story itself is so, the plot is so convoluted.
Formal.
Yeah.
And then I also was curious about what you think of some of the very short pieces that are almost like an occasional or
like Message
run.
from the Shadows.
Yeah.
It's and especially the way that they've been placed here, they feel like poetry to me. They have a narrative component, but they're about. They're just so lovely, and they feed into the longer story. I'm really glad they're there. I'm really glad that he, also writes these small, and I always understand them? No, I don't. I don't always understand the larger stories either, but I think that they have definitely more plot, which of course they have to. But the smaller, I think I love the smallest ones the best, They're so, they're just so lovely.
And you get to read them more times.
Yes.
I always feel like they like has a different way of like entering in.
The only regret I have in this is that, I feel so lucky that I've been allowed to translate this wonderful author. I regret that I haven't had the opportunity to translate some of these stories. They're so beautiful, and that's sort of the maybe the best compliment is that I'm so envious that Tim Parks got to translate. They're just gorgeous. So.
And one last question before opening it up to the audience is I'm very curious, and maybe there's actually people in the audience who can speak to this as well, how you would characterize for someone like me who can't really, who knows a few lines of Dante, what does the Italian feel like? Does it feel very modern? Does it feel very lyrical? Does it feel very how would you characterize his sound?
His sound,
especially in relation to other, like the newspaper or television or poetry, kind of where that sound is coming from in the original.
I think, this is a probably good question, but my interpretation of him, right? Because whenever you're translating, it's how I interpret, and I interpret his voice as having incredible control and being both. He's incredibly intelligent, but he's also fairly informal, not formal. Yeah, and which is wonderful to translate, especially for an American translator. What a relief, because American English is pretty informal.
The voice like someone is going to tell the story.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
it's like you and me are here, and
Yeah.
I'm telling you a story. This
Right.
is the
Right.
voice.
Yes, and there's a music to his prose that, and it's also that it's very informal. But when he wants to, he puts on the big literary guns. You know, it turns into incredibly not lofty as in pompous, but highly stylized and literary. You know, so he can do it all. So that's how I interpret what he does.
That sounds
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
Since I imagine we have some Italian speakers here and some people with a kind of connection to Tabucchi's work over time, I thought it would be nice to open it
Yeah,
up
absolutely.
to questions. People have questions.
I remember when I was reading Herrera Declares how many Britishisms there were. And I wish that there were a way to read that without having to translate the Italian myself and figure out, well, what would it be in English in America?
Mm-hmm.
Has there been an American translation yet?
Well, I mean, I don't know if the translation, because the title has been changed. Has it been? Do you know? Has it?
The reason it's changed is the Brits changed it too.
They did.
Yeah.
Okay, so it still has all of the. I mean, I don't know how this works. If it would be translated, I mean, the rights are owned, right?
It's usually just the spellings are different. In some cases, an editor will change it, make it, there's a Britishism that feels too British.
Yeah.
A careful editor will make it a little bit more American.
Right.
But they share a translation.
Yeah, and this is I mean, and this book is a combination of translators. It's not just one. And I was thinking about that, and in some ways, I was just at a conference at a Tabucchi conference, largely about Tabucchi and Calvino from French, but also other translators were there, and they were asking, as if I were the expert, which I'm not, why are there so many translators of Tabucchi? And I mean, I don't know, because there must be 10 at least.
One thing is that he was very difficult to work with.
It's very difficult to
And
work
he
with.
was very, very on the phone every day, very,
Yeah, because he's a
So-
translator himself. He's a translator himself. And it's not the case, so I met a Spanish translator, it was just a wonderful, he translated 20 of, 20.
and not just French translation.
Yeah, so, lucky me, I managed to get in on the, but I think that as a result, yes, it's a problem, there isn't one voice for him. No, it's not a problem because he doesn't have one voice. And in some ways it reflects the British translations, the American it reflects the sort of nuances and complications of translation itself, that in reading all of these different translators, I feel in some ways that you might actually maybe get Tabucchi better because you see all the things that people are wrestling with, It's a theory, a translation theoretical response, but there are some Britishisms in here as well. Not glaring ones, but there's definitely, that's definitely, but they're so beautiful. And I actually think that Tim Parks is someone I deeply admire as a translator. I think when I was offered the books, especially the first one, Tristano Dies, which was so challenging, I read Tabucchi, but I also read especially Tim Parks' translations to sort of get myself into the English mode with, and I think that his translations are gorgeous and actually maybe slightly more formal than the American ones. Do you think that's true? I think so, that maybe British translation is a little bit more formal than American translation. So, that's a difference too, but I don't mind it at all.
I was wondering if there is an example or a case, a situation where you would have liked to say, Antonio, help me, Is
Yes,
there
I
an
would.
example that you can share with
Well, there were a lot, especially with the first novel, because there were so many references, so many literary references. It's almost a quilt of literary references. It's a character who's dying. He's on his deathbed, dying of gangrene of the leg, and he's on morphine, and he's tripped out, and he's also quoting songs and Gone with the Wind and philosophy, and it was crazy. And I, Mr. Tabucchi had already died by the time that I was offered the book, and I was terrified of that book and also adored it, and I didn't want to screw it up. And so I reached out to scholars who I met with a professor in Florence who I talked with about the work. I actually contacted his French translator, who didn't really, he was very kind to respond to me, but what he said was, trust in his style. That's what he said, and that will get you very far. And, and so I also communicated with a scholar in the United States who had just finished teaching Tristano More. And so he helped me. He was so kind. It takes so many people to get a book translated. Yeah. So yes, I wish, and sometimes I do know. Sometimes I've translated work by living authors, and that can help, and it can also really be. Honestly, it can be a problem if they think they know English better than you do. So sometimes, there are these sort of trade-offs. But yeah. One example for Isabel, by the end of the novel, it's a first-person story, so it's I, but he's listening to all these other people's stories. And at one point, he sits on a bench, and this crazy fiddler-like guy shows up, almost from a Fellini movie, this is a little bit flashing.
The little ghostly presence.
Oh well. And
It's the book is right through.
well, and there is a point where there's this sort of image of this character showing up again, and then all of a sudden there's third person. He opened his eyes, and the whole novel had been in first person. And I had the manuscript because it was a posthumous, novel. I had the manuscript of it. In the Italian, it was he opened his eyes. And it just, my gut told me it was I opened my eyes, and so I asked you to contact Tabucchi's, and she said, in fact, that was an error, that was an error, and it's, it's in the Italian version. I could just feel it in my gut that it shouldn't be that, So I really would have liked to have spoken on that.
I have a question for both of you. Because the peculiarity of Tabucchi for an Italian reader is that almost all his stories and the location of the story, the character of the stories are not Italian.
Right.
And he has never a connection, I don't know, because it happens that the writer came from another country, or a family from another country, but it was completely Italian, from a small village near Pisa, so it's this. And then it started when he met the figure of Pessoa, to start in a certain way another life, discovering the language I studied Portuguese, then he teach Portuguese. He married a Portuguese woman, and all his stories, not all, but almost his stories, has connected with Portuguese. And I wonder why, and I also once asked him, but he didn't answer, why a writer, happened to a writer to decide to write of another word, a completely different word. from the one where he grew up and from the culture he was part of. So I would like to have your opinion about it.
I'm just going to throw in there that I had thought he was Portuguese. I mean, that assumption of, and that seems like a Pessoa thing to assume, a hetero, Pessoa is sitting on a bench somewhere, and yet he has these sort of seafaring, alternate counterfactual selves doing amazing things. So I don't know what the answer is, but I often wonder, I do sort of feel like it's interesting that so many writers are either literally estranged in some way, in some way they don't feel they're at the center of the culture. They feel one way or another here. And then I often think there are writers who it's interesting because all the external information would say, well, why would this person feel that way? And I think it's almost like an internal makeup. Some people just enter into the world feeling like somehow incorrectly installed. Like, and I wonder if he had that feeling, which it feels just like a human feeling, which actually maybe is like a feeling almost everyone has, that they're sort of incorrectly installed in the world.
Right.
And that's like a way to get at that estrangement while actually still being true to his self. But I mean, I think it's such an interesting question, or if also it was like almost necessary in order to have a kind of imagination, to have a literal distance from his life, because they do feel, on the one hand, so different, but they all feel like they're the same. There's a very strong, unified kind of worldview or sensibility. So maybe that estrangement helped him write while maintaining a sense of privacy.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder.
You know, I don't know. I don't, except for I do think that even while writing about Portugal and other places, that underneath it also is some scathing critique of, for instance, Italian politics. So it's that they in writing about one, there's an intention toward another. I'm certainly not with all of his work, but with Tristano Dies, that's certainly the case. I mean, this is actually one that is set in, well, it's sort of set in Italy. It might be set in Italy. He's so doped up, it's hard to tell where it's set. He winds up in Greece. He winds up in Spain. He gives water to the dog who's buried up to the neck in sand in the Prada. They put a bowl of water underneath the painting. But it's very much a critique of post-World War II Italy, and Berlusconi, and I mean, I think he's a writer of everywhere, but also that in the back, that I think Italian literary traditions, I think, are informing his approach to his writing as well.
Maybe it's interesting how many of his characters are on trains or
Yes.
on voyages.
Yeah.
I have two questions. One can be answered very briefly. I've read recently Sul filo dell'orizzonte, and I wonder whether this is one of his first works, or where is it placed?
I think it might be earlier.
Earlier.
I think it
I
might be.
don't know. I had the impression when I was reading
Yeah.
that it was an early work.
Yeah.
Which is not, of course, the same that it's not good.
Right.
But anyway, that I can check, I guess. The other question is, I was puzzled, intrigued to see how the story develops in time in a series of points, references, like searching for something who was dead already, and he gets informations to find out who this dead person really was, or just was, let's say. And at the end, so after all this search, one at a time, he gets the last information, which signals the end of the story. And it is like a cave, which make me think of a philosophical story, like the Plato's cave.
Right.
And is that an indication? And I think that's left to imagination, whether it means the protagonist is that guy. So am I wrong in saying people wrong?
No, not at all.
Would it be wrong to say that Tabucchi is a philosophical writer?
I definitely think he's a philosophical writer, without ever casting aside the storyteller, which, I mean, I think that's what's wonderful about him. Do you feel that's the case, or with his?
I
with
think
his work?
I feel unequipped to answer it, but I mean, I absolutely. I mean, like Pessoa and like Borges and like the writers that he loves, especially, for example, I feel like part of the evidence of him being a kind of philosophical writer is how surprisingly formal so many of the stories are. So they are very chatty and they're charming and engaging, but the shape of them often turns almost like a math equation, and it takes like a little turn. And that those two things together, I associate with certain kinds of inquiry. A certain kind of inquiry.
1986.
Thank you.
Any last questions? All right, thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you.
Thank you.